I'm sure that because of the historic nature of Barack Obama being the first African-American president, to say nothing of whatever he achieves or fails to achieve in his presidency, that he will be a figure who will be written about for as long as books are written. And I don't even know how long that is, but I would hope for hundreds of years.
This is the Miller Center Forum from the University of Virginia. I'm Doug Blackman. We Americans are a people often more obsessed with the biographical chestnuts of our leaders than the substance of what they hope to achieve or the record of their lives. The stories that we learn span from young George Washington and the cherry tree, Abraham Lincoln writing with a chunk of coal when he had no pencil, the superhuman recovery of President Ronald Reagan after the attempt on his life, and most recently, the improbable story of a biracial boy raised in Indonesia who improbably, and against all odds, rises to be elected President of the United States in 2008. We are served and excitedly receive an endless buffet of heartwarming anecdotes explaining the skills, abilities, and accomplishments of our leaders. At the same time, our president's enemies and opponents demonize them just as often for real, imagined, or fantastical flaws from their personal biographies. In the presidential campaign of 1800, it was the allegation, ultimately proven true 200 years later, that Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings. More recently, it has been the blatantly false yet pervasive accusation that our current president is in fact not an American citizen and therefore ineligible to occupy the White House. Joining us today is an unparalleled blazer of trails through the wilderness of presidential myth. David Maraniss, an acclaimed Washington Post editor and reporter. He was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1993 for his coverage in the Post of the presidency of Bill Clinton, and his two books on Clinton are considered classics of presidential biography. Now he has published Barack Obama, The Story, which stands out among the plethora of biographical treatments of our current president, particularly for its excruciatingly thorough re-examination of the president's own words and the reliability of his own account in shaping the myth by which many Americans already define Barack Obama. David, it's great to have you with us here today.
Terrific to be with you.
In that plethora of biography, you might call it a tidal wave of biography that has already been written about the current president, we've already seen books, many books about the president himself, about almost every policy aspect of his presidency, but we've also seen biographies of his mother, his father, his wife now, and endless more are on their way, some polemical, some very believable. Where is it that this book fits in this survival of the fittest among the literary efforts around Barack Obama? Where is your book?
I have no clue. I only know that I do what I do, and I'm sure that because of the historic nature of Barack Obama being the first African-American president, to say nothing of whatever he achieves or fails to achieve in his presidency, that he will be a figure who will be written about for as long as books are written. And I don't even know how long that is, but I would hope for hundreds of years. And so, you know, where my book will fall into that vast library of books, I can only hope but don't know, but I do know why I wrote this book, which was, well, first of all, I should say that I'd written a biography of Bill Clinton in 1990. It came out in 95. I started it in 1992. And there was an assumption, because I'd covered him during the campaign in 92, and there was an assumption that because I wrote several profiles of Barack Obama in 2008, that I would follow it up and do a biography of him. And in fact, the decision to whether to pursue this biography was one of the more difficult ones that I've made. And it was largely not because of Obama himself, but because of what I consider to be a sick American political culture that it's getting sicker, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to throw what I hoped to be a seriously reported, accurate biography into the maw of this increasingly polarized and sick culture. So my goal, in the end, I decided on election night to pursue the book. And my goal was to follow my obsessions. And I had two obsessions. One was just the incredible opportunity that the story of this person offered, whether you like his policies or not, to tell the story of the modern world through his creation, the randomness of his creation. And from Kenya and Kansas and so many other places in between, and so many of the themes of the modern world wove through the story of this family. And the second aspect was, given the contradictions that Barack Obama was born into, that he had to resolve, how did he do it? How did he figure himself out? So that's what this book is about, the world that created Barack Obama and how he recreated himself. And those were the two obsessions that drove this book.
In the book, you go, 150 pages? I think at the beginning.
164.
160, before Barack Obama
Believe
enters.
me, I've read that in several reviews.
Exactly.
And I could care less. Because people read a book, they bring into a book what their expectations are, and that's fine. I can't control that. But an author, in the end, has to decide, well, what do I want to write? And what can I offer that is deeply inside of me? And so it's not a traditional biography in the sense that it doesn't start the day he was born. And it's not an effort to just go back and give you a little bit about his parents or whatever beforehand. I mean, I was taking that seriously. I wanted to show the patterns of life that led to Barack Obama. So it goes back 3 generations on one side and 2 on the other, from Kansas and Kenya. And that's what I was trying to do. It's not just a book about Barack Obama, it's about the forces that made him possible.
Well, it's interesting because you spend a lot of time on these characters, many of whom were people he never met, and who obviously never knew he would come, since they came and went before he arrived. But it would be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about some of those characters and how it is and why it is that you think that the relevance that you saw to their lives, to the questions that you were trying to ask in the book.
Well, sure. I mean, this book took me on journeys that I never would have gone any other way. My wife and I traveled 60,000 miles around the world. So I'll start way over on the other side of the world, in Kenya. Why did I go there? I mean, you could say, well, Barack Obama really never knew his father. There was no influence there of his father. He met him once when he was 10 years old, when his dad came to Honolulu to spend a few weeks there in a misguided effort to persuade his ex-wife and bring his son, who he called his baby bull, back to Kenya with him. It was a very unhappy 3 weeks for little Barry Obama to finally encounter his father. But that was it. No other relationship whatsoever. And so what do you learn from going to Kenya? Well, many things. When I went to Kenya, it was only when I was there, there are myths on all sides of the Obama story. One of the myths from the right wing is that Barack Obama, the president, is some kind of a secret Muslim and that he's been influenced by Muslims throughout his life. And so you go to Kenya, and what I discover there is that, in fact, at every step along the way in the rise of the Obamas in Kenya, it was evangelical Christians from the West who made the rise possible. That it was missionaries from the Seventh-day Adventist Church who came to the small village of Kendu Bay on the shores of Lake Victoria, where the Obama clan was living, and brought Westernization there and taught Obama's grandfather, Hussein Onyango, English. Now, Hussein Onyango is part of that mythology because when he was in the military with the British, aligned with the British in World War I, he ended up in Zanzibar and converted to Islam. And so that's part of the mythology of President Obama's connections to being a Muslim. In fact, Hussein Onyango, as I discovered from my research in Kenya, was not a devout Muslim in any sense. You know, he drank, he smoked, he womanized. I mean, he had a lot of different aspects to him that were not exactly strictly Muslim. But he was also, you know, he had a British tea set. You know, he was much more sort of evoking that part of the Brits. The woman in Kenya who's most sort of associated in the American minds with President Obama is his step-grandmother, Granny Sarah, who's in his memoir, Dreams from My Father. So we went to visit her out in the village of Nyangoma Kogelo. And she's now like the queen mother of Kenya. You know, her compound is surrounded by gates. There are satellite dishes inside. There are factotums checking everything, and security guards and trinket salespeople and everything around that. So when I went to visit her, one of her factotums was sort of in charge of vetting me. And he was a young law student who claimed he was some part of the relatives of the Obamas. And his first question was, so you wrote a biography of President Clinton. How much money did President Clinton get from your book? Meaning he was asking for a bribe. And then a little while later, the question was, Mr. David, is that Christian or Jew? To which I answered both. Because it is, and I am, but anyway, the end result of all of that was that day I did not get the interview. We eventually did get the interview. I found Mama Sarah to be a completely unreliable narrator. She's a step-grandmother. She's the stepmother of Barack Obama Sr., who in my other reporting I discovered didn't even like her. But there was this division within the family that led President Obama as a young man to be with her on her side of this family division. So he wrote about her more. And I found the real relatives living in relative isolation in anonymity about 50 miles away over in the village of Kanyadiyang. That's where Barack Obama Sr.'s blood sister was, and several other relatives from whom I got a more reliable story. One of the myths about Barack Obama's grandfather that the president innocently perpetrates in his book is that he was imprisoned by the British and tortured by the British for 6 months because he supported Mau Mau, the early fight for independence. And I hold out a sliver of possibility because I try to take all these things seriously and not just prejudge. There's a sliver of possibility that it happened, but there are no documents that I could find that proved it. But I did interview 6 people who knew the grandfather, Hussein Onyango, during that period, who said it didn't happen, that Granny Sarah just sort of invented this story. So, you know, that's part of the Obama story that's important to report out. Another aspect that was interesting to me, I mean, so first you've got this notion of the Muslims, and in fact it was evangelical Christians, which goes on further. I should take that story one step further. Barack Obama Sr., who was basically an atheist, was nonetheless trained at an Anglican school in Maseno, and then after he finished that, his mentor, the reason that he ever got to the United States, the reason that President Obama exists, is because of another evangelical Christian, a wonderful, fascinating woman named Betty Mooney, whose grandfather was the founder of Texas Christian University, and she was part of this literacy movement that was faith-based, founded by a man named Frank Laubach, who would go around the world teaching literacy and spreading the gospel at the same time. She came to Kenya, encountered Barack Obama Sr., mentored him, hired him to translate some of her literacy books and gospel books into the Luo language, his tribal language, and she's the one who got him to the University of Hawaii. Obama wouldn't exist without these Christians, and Muslims had nothing to do with it. So that's one of the reasons I go to places like Kenya that have nothing, you know, might seem like, what does that have to do with the Obama story?
Well, you also, I mean, that's a story that at least many of us have heard some version of. We know something about that he has this African past and the father. The story of his maternal family, particularly going back beyond the grandparents, is one that I think is much less familiar to most Americans.
In Kansas, yeah. And my book starts on Thanksgiving night, 1926, when his great-grandmother, Ruth Armour Dunham, commits suicide in a dank auto garage in Topeka, Kansas. And she has two sons, 8 years old and 10 years old. The 8-year-old is Stanley Dunham, who is President Obama's grandfather. And after the mother kills herself, largely because her husband was unfaithful and she was a very unhappy woman, Stanley Dunham, the president's grandfather, and his brother moved to a small town in Kansas called El Dorado. They pronounce it that way, not El Dorado in Kansas. And he lives with his grandparents, sort of the first iteration of someone in this family lineage living with grandparents. And when he arrives at his grandparents' house in El Dorado, his great-grandfather is still alive, a guy named Christopher Columbus Clark. And there's something really sort of magical about this moment, because here you have Stanley Dunham, age 8, living with his great-grandfather, Christopher Columbus Clark, who fought in the Civil War for the North, for the Missouri militia at the end of the war against the bushwhackers. And that same Stanley Dunham is connected in his lifetime to the Civil War and to the first African-American president of the United States. But this family, the Kansas side of the family, is sort of a classic American, a story of American searching. Stanley Dunham, who was 8 years old when at the time he grew up to be sort of what I call a combination of Willie Loman and Walter Mitty. A man of great dreams and who could talk better than he could act, and was constantly after the next thing and constantly searching and moving, taking the family to Oklahoma and back, to Texas and back, finally further west to suburban Seattle, to Mercer Island, a furniture salesman and an insurance salesman, and then he goes even further west to Honolulu, ends up there in 1960, which is bringing his daughter with him. And that daughter, who is President Obama's late mother, was also named Stanley Dunham, same name as her dad. And the assumption that President Obama had was that his mom was named after her father. And that makes sense, you know, it's a classic case of a sexist man wanting a boy and not getting one, so naming, you know, imposing this name on his daughter. But my research led me to a different conclusion, which was that it was the mother that made the decision. And that mother, Madeline Dunham, grew up in a town near El Dorado, Augusta, Kansas. And she was the type of woman, very smart, who didn't want to be trapped in that small town existence. And she longed for something more sophisticated, and she'd go to the theater in Augusta and watch Bette Davis movies, and that's what she wanted to be. She wanted to be cosmopolitan and sophisticated, and she started to smoke with a cigarette holder and even changed her vocabulary to sound more like Bette Davis. So she got pregnant, and in 1942, a few months before her daughter was born, a movie came to the Augusta Theater starring Bette Davis, playing a woman named Stanley. That's where it came from.
And so from those two narratives, I mean, and I think you make it very clear in the book that from that sort of African narrative, that these generations of ancestors who successfully straddled cultures, and
Yes.
And the inference that then is a foreshadowing or establishment of some pattern that Obama would follow. But one, is that right? But also in terms of his maternal heritage and his white family, what are the things that descend to the character of the man who's president now?
Well, you see aspects of all of his ancestors in President Obama. From his grandfather, Stanley Dunham, mostly, interestingly enough, it's physical characteristics and features. He's got that long face. If you've ever seen a picture of Stanley Dunham, the grandfather, it's Barack Obama, but white and not black. Same big ears, the same long face, and tall and thin. I'm not sure what other characteristics he got from that guy. Maybe cigarette smoking, maybe pot smoking, actually. From the grandmother, Madeline Dunham, the one who wanted to be Betty Davis, she ended up being the rock of the family. She couldn't rely on her husband to hold a steady job. I mean, he had jobs, he wouldn't bring home much money. He was an insurance salesman who didn't want to be one. He thought he was a writer. He claimed that he was a writer. That's how he wooed Madeline in the first place. He came back from a trip to California and said that he got to know William Saroyan and John Steinbeck, and he had a bunch of writings in his trunk. Madeline's brother, after Stanley went into the Army right after that, Madeline's brother looked into the trunk and there was nothing there. That's sort of the Walter Mitty aspect of this guy. But in any case, so Madeline, throughout that whole marriage, was this pragmatic, steady. She had her own internal demons. When I interviewed President Obama in the Oval Office, he was talking about his grandparents, and he said, my favorite TV show is Mad Men. I don't know if people in here, anyone who's watched it. And he said, that was my grandparents, all that smoking and drinking and stuff. That's exactly what he said. And then he said, and my grandmother, Madeline, was the character Peggy. And in Mad Men, Peggy is she starts as a secretary and becomes an ad executive. And President Obama's grandmother started as a secretary and became a vice president of a bank in Hawaii. Constantly training young men who would go on to be her bosses, but she did finally rise to vice president, although she never got equal pay for it. But she was incredibly pragmatic, not particularly an extrovert or openly affectionate, but a rock, very solid. And that pragmatic side of President Obama comes from that grandmother completely. And even the fact that he's where he is today, he owes as much to her as anyone else. Sometimes people ask, well, how did he get into these schools and how did he pay for them, from Punahou to Occidental to Columbia to Harvard? His grandmother was largely responsible for that. She helped him get into Punahou because the president of that bank was the chief of the board of directors of Punahou School, this elite prep school. She was the one bringing home the money, and she helped pay for his tuition at Occidental and Columbia. He also got some scholarships. But she was incredibly important. Then you go to his mom, Stanley Ann Dunham, who throughout high school just wanted to be called Stanley. She was a very sardonic, independent young woman who never really got along too well with her dad, thought he was too full of bullshit, or BS. But she was always looking, she didn't want to be trapped, like her mom, she didn't want to be trapped in smallness. She wanted to be open to the whole world. So, at age 17, because she was born in late November, she was always a year ahead in school. She's a freshman at the University of Hawaii and meets this incredibly charismatic, brilliant African and falls head over heels for the guy. And
at a time when that's a fairly radical thing to have happen.
1960, very rare. I mean, Virginia still had miscegenation laws, as did a third of the states in the United States, anti-miscegenation laws. But from his mother, to get back to your question, you see the internationalist, idealistic side of President Obama. And she, when they were, you said that he grew up in Indonesia. He spent 3 years there, most of it in Honolulu. But in any case, in those 3 years when they were in Indonesia, she was waking up way before dawn to homeschool him before he'd go off to the local school. And was constantly sort of inculcating him in her philosophy of life, which was a humanist philosophy. Be open to the whole world. And also, as he grew older and was in high school and was, he was a pretty good student, but he wasn't applying himself, and he mostly was playing basketball and smoking marijuana. She's the one who kept saying, Bear, you're special. You're here for a reason. You can do more. And he'd hear her voice, and that eventually got to him and pushed him in the directions that he went. So you get the pragmatism from the grandmother, you get the physical characteristics from the grandfather, and the idealism from his mother.
What was it like talking to the President of the United States about these kinds of personal matters? I mean, this is not a conventional, triumphal American family history.
Well, in a sense, it is. I mean, it depends on how you define triumphal. I mean, it's an incredible rise, and it's classic American in that it's also involves the whole world, which is the way I view America, is that, I suppose, embracing the entire world and not just provincial. So when I did my biography of President Clinton, I interviewed him 7 times during the campaign, and then once I started doing the book, it was like that peanut strip character of Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown. Every time I'd set up an interview, and at the last minute, his Dee Myers or one of his press people would call me and say, he's just not ready to talk to you. He doesn't feel comfortable talking to you. I'd interviewed 350 of his people who knew him. I mean, there are probably 20,000 that you could talk to about Bill Clinton, but
how many of whom did he date is the question.
But in any case, so I never got the interview with Clinton, but I did get tons of his letters and talked to everybody around him, and it was fine. With President Obama, but my policy always is I don't want to interview the main subject of a book until I know as much or more about their lives as they do, or their families' lives. So President Obama was my last interview. I knew he was going to do it. He wasn't going to back away from it. But I was trying to figure out, well, how do I break the ice with him? And, I'd written a biography of Vince Lombardi. I'm from Wisconsin. I'm a Packer fan. And Obama spent his adult years in Chicago, and he's proudly a Bears fan. So there you go. So I remembered that 2 years ago, when the Bears played the Packers in the game that would decide who went to the Super Bowl, President Obama announced proudly, if the Bears win, I'm going to the Super Bowl. Packers won. So after the game, Charles Woodson, who's a star player for the Packers, got in the dressing room, got up and said, President Obama won't come see us in the Super Bowl, we'll go see him at his house. Because if you win a championship, you get to go to the White House. So when I walked into the Oval Office, my first words were, President Obama, great to meet you. Charles Woodson got here before you, but I'm glad we both finally made it. To which he responded, man, those Packers were rough on me. And I said, well, deservedly so, you're a Bears fan. And he said, yeah, but every time I come to Wisconsin, they give me another share of Packer stock. For those of you who don't know, the Packers are the only publicly owned enterprise in professional sports in America, and they give out stock, which is kind of worthless, but you feel like you're an owner of the team. So Obama has this whole collection of Packer stock, more than I have. And he keeps coming to Wisconsin because it's a swing state. So he was there just 2 days ago. But then I had let him. I wanted the interview to be as productive as possible. I knew I'd get only one shot at it.
And how long were you able to talk to him?
Well, it was scheduled for 45 minutes. It went on for an hour and a half. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is he knew I knew a lot. I let him read the introduction to my book, not to have any say in it, but just to know all the places I'd gone and some of the parameters of what I'd found. And I also let him see a copy of the table of contents, because I knew that chapter 17 would go boing. Chapter 17 is called Genevieve in the Veil. Genevieve was his girlfriend that no one had found before. And I knew that he would want to keep talking to find out where she is and how she was doing. So, and I also knew that his staff would have no clue what Genevieve meant, but then when he saw that on it, so that actually worked. But the other aspect of it was that in my introduction and throughout the book, I deal with the issue of his memoir and what it says, and also what I was finding as an historian about some of those same events, and the discrepancies between the two. And it was important for me to point it out, but also important for me to put it into context. There's a difference between memoir and biography. And many of the stories that he was telling in his memoir were just reiterations of what he'd learned from his family. And anyone in this room, think about it. You hear stories from you heard stories from your parents or uncles or aunts or people, may or may not be true, but you didn't have an historian coming by later to say, you know, did that really happen or not? So the story of his grandfather being imprisoned, there was another one about his step-grandfather. His mother remarried an Indonesian. That's how they ended up in Jakarta, Lolo Sutoro. And the story that President Obama repeats in his memoir is that the grandfather on the Indonesian side was killed as a martyr fighting the Dutch in the fight for independence in Indonesia. So I went to Indonesia, and with my wonderful Indonesian researcher there, we discovered that, in fact, that grandfather had died falling off an ottoman, changing the drapes in his living room. A slightly different story. But also in his memoir, there's more serious discrepancies to some degree, where he uses composite characters and compresses the chronology. And
which he acknowledged.
He acknowledges in the introduction to his book. So some people have made a huge deal out of that. I put it into the context, and you know, it's not something that as a trained journalist with a lifetime of working at the Washington Post I would ever consider doing. But I understand why he did it and how he did it. And his memoir was essentially an attempt to look at his life through the lens of race. And as a matter of fact, I got a copy of his first proposal, and the original title was Journeys in Black and White. So in his memoir, he takes some characters who happen to be African American and can help him make a point about race and enhances their role in his life, sometimes to his later difficulty. For instance, he writes about a character named Frank, who's an old black guy in Honolulu. So the right wing, I mean, everybody finds out that this Frank was really Franklin Marshall Davis, who was an old poet and lefty who had once belonged to the Communist Party in Chicago. So the notion now, I mean, there's so many mythologies. I mean, you and I both wrote about Bill Clinton. We know how many there can be. In his case, a couple were true. But in any case, so one of the mythologies is that Franklin Marshall Davis is really Obama's father. I mean, that's how nuts this gets. But another one is that this old communist is the one who trained Obama, and therefore, in his second term, he's going to show his true socialist colors, and it all goes back to Frank Marshall Davis. In fact, Obama was making more out of Davis than he really was in his life, because when he wrote the book, he was in his early 30s, and he wanted to present himself as sort of cooler and a little more edgy than he really was, give his book a little more juice. So he enhanced Frank Marshall Davis, or the Frank character, who is Frank Marshall Davis. Then there are other characters who aren't even in the book, who are his white friends, who are much more influential in his real life. So there's a lot of that going on in his memoir, for better or worse. To me, it's all explainable within the differences of the genres of history and memoir. Not that I would do it myself or justify it all, but I don't think it's a huge deal. But in any case, we went over that in our conversation in the Oval Office, and he said, after reading my introduction, he said, you know, David, this is really interesting. It's a well-written introduction, but he said, but you call my book fiction. So I said, no, Mr. President, actually I complimented you. I called it literature. And his press secretary, Jay Carney, was over. He was the only person in the room, and he was busily reading through my introduction. He had a copy of it to see what I'd done, and he was trying to tell Mr. Obama that in fact, I hadn't called it fiction. But then we went over all of these various cases, from the grandfather to Genevieve, who is a composite in the book as well. And in every case, with one minor exception, he said, well, David, you're probably right. So it was resolved that way.
One of the interesting things I think about your book is that, without really making an obvious point of it, you challenge what has been a very basic idea of American perceptions around race, and that is that race is essentially the paramount factor in the identification of who a person is. And I think that in your book you really make the case that that race doesn't necessarily trump all other kinds of nature and nurture, but that here is a figure who's defined visibly by race, but by no means is that the paramount element.
I think you're right, but I don't want to go overboard the other direction either. I mean, I think that Barack Obama's, the arc of the second half of my book and of his life is a search for home. Now, some of that is very deeply rooted in race, because he was born biracial in Hawaii, growing up with his white mother and white grandparents. And in one sense, Hawaii was a wonderful place for him to grow up because it is so diverse itself. It's a land of hapa, which is the native Hawaiian term for people who are half and half. And, they're Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, Okinawans, Haulis are the Anglos, native Hawaiians, Polynesians, every possible mix of peoples. One of the key friends in high school was a kid named Tom Topolinski. He sounds Polish, he was Chinese. It's that kind of place. But there weren't that many African Americans there. So here he is, he's born having to deal with race from the day he's born because of the color of his skin, but in no way acclimated culturally to being an African American. Mm-hmm. There were not many around, they weren't in his family. So that is definitely a part of the arc. But there are so many other aspects to his search for home. One is that he never knew his father, and that his mother was not around all the time, and that he was living with these grandparents who were doing their best, but he never really had sort of a real sense of comfort of who he was and where he was. And so that arc leads him all the way to Chicago and Michelle. And yes, the race is an important part of it, but it's not the whole aspect of it. There's so many other factors to his existence. And I think that there's a tendency, because he's the first African-American president, and because of the enormous role of race in American culture and history, and for all of its awfulness in many ways, I don't want to diminish in any way what that meant, but I want to, he's a human being. And like all human beings, there's so many other elements that go into how somebody figures themselves out than just race.
Toward the end of the book, and this will be the last question for me in this stage of things, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But toward the end of the book, you talk about some what you identify as sort of pivotal events that really define that end of that period of Barack Obama's life before he then is launched into this next phase as he heads away to Harvard. Why don't you talk about what you see as those pivotal events?
Well, I would look at it from the time he left Honolulu for college. That's the arc toward home. It's from Los Angeles to New York to Chicago. And it starts a little bit in Los Angeles at Occidental College, where he starts to get that first sense of destiny, that his mother's voice is coming back to him. Now, I want to say one thing before I get there. There's someone in the audience today who was Bill Clinton's college roommate, Tom Campbell, a great guy. And so when I say this, he'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Clinton wanted to be president from the time he was born, basically. And By the time he got to Georgetown, he had already run for every office he could in high school at Hot Springs High, to the point where finally, when he was a senior, the principal said, "Billy, you can't run for class president. We're sick of you." So he ran for class secretary instead, which is traditionally in that sexist era was reserved for a woman, a girl. So he ran against his girlfriend, and she beat him. And he wouldn't talk to her for weeks. So he gets to Georgetown, and he's freshman class president, sophomore class president. In his junior year, he runs for senior class president, and his peers are sick of him, and they defeat him again. But Clinton was constantly running. His whole life is running for. Barack Obama was completely different. In high school, he was not involved in politics at all. Didn't run for anything. Played basketball. I was part of a little chum gang of pot smokers, and that was it. A good student, but not doing anything more active. Accidentally starts to get that seed of purpose. Then after 2 years there, the sense is that Occidental is too much like Punahou, the elite prep school. It's sun-washed, upper middle class, too easy. So he decides to go to New York. New York, he's there for 4 years, and they're really pivotal, but not in the way you would expect. He went there thinking that he wanted to get closer to the grit of real America and closer to African-American experience, closer to Harlem. Columbia's up near Harlem. But he didn't experience it in the way that you would think. He was introverted for all of those 4 years. For instance, at Columbia for those 2 years, he made no lasting African-American friends. Most of his friends were Pakistanis who he'd met at Occidental or friends in New York City. And these are really an interesting group of guys who have been laid low until my book because, again, of this sickness of American culture, the assumption that if they're Pakistanis, they're Muslims, and therefore that's part of the Muslim conspiracy. One of them was the vice president of PepsiCo, hardly a Muslim radical. The other guy sells as a broker, but in any case, that was his New York experience, along with a couple of girlfriends who I found, white girlfriends. But he was, in that period, writing every day, keeping a journal, trying to figure himself out. He walked and took the subways around New York City carrying a dog-eared copy of Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's book, and he really was, in a sense, an invisible man, seeing society, but society not seeing him. He graduates, he wants to go to Chicago, because Chicago at that point is the heartbeat of Black America. He naively applies for a job in the administration of Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago, thinking he could get a job, this unknown guy from New York. You don't do that in Chicago, it's who brung you, right? But 2 years later, he did get hired and came to be a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. And within a 6-month period, 3 people arrived in Chicago, 3 African Americans. The first was Oprah Winfrey, the second was Michael Jordan, and the third was Barack Obama. 2 who became world famous within months, and 1 who was utterly anonymous, Barack Obama. But Chicago was so pivotal, Doug, to him. It's where he found himself personally and professionally. He found himself personally in this long search for a home. He found it in Chicago. He found it in the African-American community. For some reason, he couldn't do it in New York, but in Chicago, working on the south side, 98% African-American part of Roseland. The people he was working with were largely these boisterous, buoyant, middle-aged African-American women who just engulfed him in the chaos and love of their lives. And he felt a sense of home he'd never felt before. That really was sort of, you don't see Michelle yet, but she's the inevitable end to that. And then professionally, as a community organizer, he wasn't a classic one. He wasn't confrontational in the way that most community organizers are. It's just not in his nature. But he was able in that period to study power. very astutely, and he watched Harold Washington operate, he watched politicians operate, and after 3 years he decided that for him to make the changes he wanted to, he had to go into electoral politics. And that's where my book ends, with him making that decision, going to Africa to find his roots, then heading up to Harvard Law School, where his political life begins. All of that, professionally and personally, those 3 years in Chicago to start were the pivotal points.
That's great. Thank you. You dispense with the birther question in just a few paragraphs, but pretty effectively in your book. Why don't you tell us about that?
For President Obama to have not been born in Honolulu on August 4th, 1961, it would have had to have been a massive conspiracy that involved the local newspapers, both Honolulu newspapers, which published the birth notices of Barack Hussein Obama II's birth, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was tracking Barack Obama Sr. during that entire period because he was in Honolulu on a student visa, a J visa, and the INS didn't like him. They thought he was a bigamist, which he was. He'd been married before in Kenya and not divorced. And so I have the documents of them following him during that entire period. If he and Stanley had left and gone to Mombasa to be born in Kenya, he never would have gotten back in the country. The third aspect of it goes back to his mother's name. The week that President Obama was born, it was sort of notable at Kapiolani Medical Center. One of the well-known doctors there went to lunch with a journalist who said, "Well, what interesting happened to you this week?" And he said, "Well, Stanley had a baby." The nurses and doctors at that hospital remembered when Stanley had a baby.
David, thank you very much for your book. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you.
It's a real work of art, and I appreciate it particularly because I'm a Kansan. I was born in the eastern part of Kansas. I know that El Dorado is the way you pronounce that. My question to you, I've always been fascinated by the Kansas state motto, which is ad aspera per aspera,
right,
which is to the stars through difficulty.
Yes.
And I wondered that as that was named because of Kansas' difficulty in getting to the Union, the stars representing the United States, that if there wasn't some part of destiny that was played in this with Stanley and her being a Kansan, that it was the destiny of Barack Obama to get to the epitome, the office of the president of the stars, through the difficulties that he had.
You know, that's a fascinating thing to think about. I'm not a fatalist. I don't know that I believe in destiny per se, but I'm always stunned by the connections in history, and that these things seem to connect back in those interesting ways. I don't know how to explain it, and I tend to think that it's a combination of chaos and something else, but you're absolutely right, you know, and that's why some people wonder, why does he write so much about Kansas? That's exactly why. Because, you know, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is at the heart of race, the history of race in America. And it was right there, and El Dorado was founded by abolitionists who came down from Lawrence, Kansas. You know, and so all of that, you know, goes back through that act and through Abraham Lincoln, and then you end up with the Barack Obama. I love those connections of history. So thanks for asking.
Barack Obama has been influenced by what you've said by two very strong women, his grandmother and his mother. Could you speak more about Michelle, and if you interviewed her, and any surprising things you might have learned about their relationship and her influence?
Michelle will be in my second volume. I have not interviewed her because she doesn't do interviews for these types of books. She hasn't talked to any of the biographers, but I think she will talk to me for the second volume. But I know quite a bit about her. I've done a lot of the research for my second book, which won't come for many years. And the interesting thing about Michelle, first of all, even though she's not in this first book, she's in the first book. She is the inevitable end of his search toward home. And so in that sense, she's both symbolic and real and important in every possible sense. She affirmed his African-American sensibility. She offered him the family that he never had. She provided a strong nuclear family for him, which he never experienced before. And in terms of their political, personal relationship, it's not like the Clintons. It's not Clinton and Clinton. It's not, but she's a very strong woman. And for many years, she didn't want him to have anything to do with politics and was constantly pounding on the guy to, you know, if you lose again, you're out. Yet, she has adapted to the White House even better than he has. And I think she loves being First Lady.
There's been some conservative criticism of the president along these lines that suggests that the influence on the president of Valerie Jarrett and Secretary of State Clinton and Obama, this sort of Michelle Obama, this sort of triumvirate of women in his lives, powerful women, and that they are decisive and that he is less decisive, and that somehow this relates to his relationship with his grandmother and such. Do you make any?
Well, why is that a criticism?
Not mine.
But I mean, I mean that deeply, but I also, you know, I mean, Hillary Rodham Clinton, when President Obama went into office, he was reading Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. He really didn't follow through on that entirely, but he did with Hillary. And I think that she has been the most important appointment he's made. I think that when he asked her to join him, she was against it. And it was an interesting that President Obama and Bill Clinton, who really didn't like each other at all, were the two pushing her to take the job. And of course, their relationship has evolved over the last 4 years to a much stronger point. I mean, when you study presidents, you'll find almost all of them were shaped more by strong women than strong fathers. I mean, there's some exceptions. George W. Bush, obviously, but he was almost, in many ways, he's more of a psychological study of rebellion against his dad, both before his presidency and during it. But you know, from Clinton didn't know his father. Obama, Ronald Reagan's dad was an alcoholic. Nixon, I mean, all of them had stronger women in their lives. And Jimmy Carter's mother, Lillian. So, I mean, you know, I mean, that is an underappreciated part of American history, the role of women in all these presidents.
Hi, thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It's been really great. Thanks. So you mentioned a little bit before about a sick political culture in America. Right. And with the coming election, there's been a lot of, on both sides, both on the president's side and Mitt Romney's side, there's been a lot of negative publicity. So I was wondering what your advice is as a journalist and someone who knows a lot about politics and the president. What would be your advice, for example, for a young student who wants to make an informed decision this November, how to navigate the media sensationalism and find out really who these people are and what is important to them?
You know, I'm always hesitant to tell anyone else how to think, so I would not do that. But you have to be open to not just one of the things that's happened with the polarization of American politics and culture is that, you know, I think that technology is neutral, but it can lead to good or bad effects. And one of what I consider the sick effects is that it's so easy for people now to just completely look for reaffirmation of what they already believe and be totally closed to anything else. And so, you know, I mean, that's why 35% of the people who watch Fox News think Obama's a Muslim. And you know, there are other examples on the other side. But so, first of all, look for primary documents. Read deeply into what both people are saying and what they've accomplished. And and try not to just be influenced, first of all, by, I mean, all of the advertising is complete, you know, I mean, that's just trying, I mean, it's manipulating just like any other commercial. You can't stop it, you can't avoid it, but it's playing to your baser instincts in almost every case. And, you know, my advice to all, I mean, I mostly talk to journalists, but it holds true for anybody, which is don't just follow the conventional wisdom, think for yourself.
David, in 2008, was the president sufficiently vetted? Was his memoir dissected sufficiently by the media then? Should we have heard more about all this pot smoking you keep referring to?
Oh, you know, probably not. He probably wasn't sufficiently vetted. I mean, I don't, but vetting, there's something about that word that bugs me. You know, I don't think that the public can know too much about somebody who's going to be a president, because the president affects every one of our lives so significantly. So that you want to understand both the substance of what they've done and the substance of who they are. You know, in one sense, what they say they will do is important, but so often contradicted by what happens. The events that they face once they're president are almost invariably completely different from what they talk about in the campaign. So what seems like a big issue at one point becomes irrelevant a few months later. But to understand the patterns of how they think, how they respond to crises, what were the forces that shaped them, I think you can't do enough of that beforehand. And in President Obama's case, he came so suddenly that, you know, I don't blame it entirely on the press, but it takes a while. I mean, it took me 4 years to get this information. It's not like you can just Google it. You know, people today think you can. I mean, Bob Woodward went to Yale last year famously, and some students said, well, you know, we could have figured out Watergate. We would have Googled it.
On that note, a change of pace, if President Obama were reelected, do you think he would be in any way a different kind of president in his second term than he has been in his first?
Yes, I do. I think that President Obama has a certain contradiction in him, which is that he has this outward appearance of being cool. You know, in Hawaii, there's a saying, cool head main thing, and he keeps that coolness. But he's fiercely competitive inside. I've said that Clinton's hot and Obama's cool, but inside they burn at the same temperature. So as a campaigner, you're not going to see it. But that his history, if you study it, is not that he's a closet socialist who's going to be further to the left in his second term, but exactly the opposite. That if he's freed in his second term from the political restraints, he's going to go for what he really is, which is someone who tries to embrace a lot. There's a letter in my book he wrote when he was 22 years old where he talks about all of his friends finding these different narrow niches in their lives. And he said, in one sense, he's envious of them, but in another sense, for him to justify his own existence, he can't be like that he has to try to embrace it all. And I think, you know, that's what you heard in that 2004 speech by which everybody got to know him. I think that's the real Obama, and I think that to the extent that he can do it in this polarized, you know, culture and polarized Washington, if he wins re-election, some of that has to drop. I mean, when the Republicans announced, when Mitch McConnell said publicly, right after Obama was elected, that our #1 mission is to not let him get reelected. They can't say that if he wins again. And there'll be all kinds of different undercurrents in the Republican Party if he happens to win again. But it can't be any harder for him than it was in the first term. And I think that he's going to move in that direction toward trying to resolve what is really the central problem in long-term problem in the country today, which is the fiscal mess. I think he's going to work on that like he and Boehner almost did, but weren't able to accomplish in the first term.
David, we got a quick question that comes to us via Facebook from Juliet Davis Feeney in New York City. She asked whether you've read The Obamas by Jodi Kantor and whether there's any clash between that book and your book, but more generally, in this repertoire of Obama books that have already come out, is there a book out there that you particularly disagree with, or anyone you think has particularly gotten it wrong?
Man, oh man, are there? Well, I'll name the books that I respect first. Jodi's is one of them. Jodi is a very earnest and smart reporter for the New York Times. In her book, it doesn't conflict with mine. It's about a completely different subject, which is the Obama's relationship in the White House. Janie Scott, another former New York Times reporter, did a biography of Stanley Ann Dunham, which she did the real work. And Sally Jacobs of the Boston Globe did a biography of Barack Obama Sr. And when I was researching my book, I came across their tracks at various times, and so I knew they were doing the real research. David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, did an earlier biography of President Obama, which in classic Remnick style is very smart about race. He didn't travel the world like I did, and it's a different level of reporting. Then there are books that I don't respect. The Amateur by Ed Klein, he did do some reporting. It's basically a political diatribe. You start with a presupposition and then set out to prove it, which is the antithesis of what I believe in as an historian. Dinesh D'Souza is incredibly popular right now with his 2 books and 1 movie, all of which are claiming that America will be utterly different in 2016 if Obama's reelected, and that he's really a socialist. And he has all these anti-colonial motivations, that he hates America and that he wants to diminish America. And Dinesh D'Souza is a professor who I think is violating every standard of serious history. I don't know him personally, but I find his arguments tendentious and wrong. I think he doesn't know Obama. He didn't do the original research. In the documentary, he's posing in Indonesia, and he interviews Obama's stepbrother in Kenya. The stepbrother is completely irrelevant and is a phony. His take on Obama and anti-colonialism is at once wrong and wrong-headed at the same time. It's wrong because Obama was not influenced by that anti-colonialism of his father. And secondly, what's so great about colonialism? I would put that book in that category as well. I mean, there are others that are even trashier that I'm not even going to talk about.
You talked at some length about the race matter of President Obama. You referred to him as a black president and also as an Afro-American president. And I'm just curious, and by the way, I support Obama. What's, in some sense, the accurate term is a mulatto. Do you use that word in your book?
I do not.
Okay.
I use
Why?
I've never used that word in my life. That's why. I call him biracial. I mean, why? What is mulatto? I mean, mulatto is considered a slur word now. Oh, so yeah. There's no reason why I would use it or not use it if it weren't. But if you can, I mean, I think that the fact that he's biracial is a very important part of his life, and there are interesting questions around that. Some of which he dealt with in his race speech in Philadelphia, but some of which, I mean, I'm willing to talk about anything to do with race because I think it's, something that should be talked about. I mean, people say, well, he's black and white. Why does he call himself black? Yeah. Well, you shouldn't ask him that. You should ask society that. Why do they judge everybody that way? I mean, he had to deal with that. Now, so it's not like, I mean, I think that perhaps luckily, he's of the last generation where kids who are biracial have to make that, are forced by society to make that choice. And now you see a lot of university kids here at Virginia and every college campus who are biracial of all different sorts. And they're more comfortable just dealing in that realm than having to choose. But Obama was of a generation where society forced you to choose. And he struggled with that, and that's a central part of my book.
David, you touched on this a little earlier, but we'll close with this question. What is the state of political reporting today? It seems to many of us that the serious work of understanding candidates and understanding issues is left to 400-page books, and that very little makes it, or oftentimes much less of it, makes it onto the pages of what people read every day. But what are we to do with this state of political reporting?
Well, I think that everything is in flux and transition right now. I mean, you know, the whole media world is uncertain. You know, you've got Twitter and Instagram and Tumblr and all these things I don't even know about. And there's an emphasis on speed and attitude. But again, I think that the technology is neutral and it can be used for good purposes. And I found I'm a newcomer to Twitter, but I find that when an event is breaking, I actually can get more news more quickly and interestingly there than anywhere else. But also, if every reporter is just tweeting away and not really reporting, it's worthless. So whatever the venues, the formats, whatever ways that news is presented, I just believe in two things. One is that humankind has a need for story to help understand them. I mean, all of us are shaped by stories. And secondly, there's always a need for the search for truth. And as long as those two things can exist, then I think we'll be okay, and society will figure out how to adjust to all the new technologies. But right now it's in transition. I mean, I think that a few newspapers and other venues are still doing that deep reporting, but it's a little bit less emphasized now. And part of it is actually probably physiological. I think that, the people in this room are not of that generation, but younger generations are so accustomed to speed that I remember I had an editor once who described somebody as having the attention span of a bicentennial minute. And now it's the attention span of, 5 seconds is forever when you're waiting for something to come up on your computer. We're dealing with that almost physiological change in terms of people's attention spans as well. I don't know where it's all going, but as long as humans still need story and the people believe in the search for truth, then I think it'll come out okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.